In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the concept of self-consciousness.
So you're always in a situation, and occurs across multiple levels of analysis, because I could say, well, when are you in a garden? And one answer could be, well, when you're in a beautiful house, or in a beautiful hotel, or in a well-functioning institution, or in a city that's working. But I could also say, you're in a garden when your conception of the world is sufficient that when you enact it, it allows the world to be fruitful. That's a garden too, right? So your internal psychological structure, the conceptions that you use, first of all, they're obviously analogous to culture, but they're also analogous to a garden in that way. And like culture, they can be disrupted. So, you know what it's like. People say this all the time. I wish that hadn't happened. And what they mean by that is, geez, I was in a pretty good place before that event occurred. You know, and a big moral error can really do that to you. You know, you do something that you really think is stupid, and you know, you're just shattered, really. Sometimes shattered enough to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So, you can't get rid of the snakes. That's the first idea in the story. Well, then the issue is, well, what do you do with the snakes? Well, God basically told even Adam not, well, he didn't really tell them not to interact with the snakes, and he put a snake in there. I think it's partly because, in a sense, it's not possible to create a garden without having a snake in it, because you can't keep everything out. It's not possible. Okay, so the snake comes along and it says, well, if you do this thing that God forbade, a lot of wonderful things will happen. Well, this is where it gets extraordinarily complicated, you know. Let me finish this part of the story, and then we'll go back. The serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes will be opened, and you will be as gods, knowing good and evil. Okay, so what can we conclude from that? Well, the first thing is that their eyes were closed. Because if they weren't closed, then how could they be opened? And the second thing is they didn't know the difference between good and evil. Okay, so that explains the whole ashamed, naked, and not ashamed issue, because if your eyes are closed, well, that's irrelevant. And if there's no moral knowledge, there's obviously no shame. So what's happening here is that there's a very profound distinction being made between the before fruit eating state of being and the after fruit eating state of being. Or the before fruit eating and snake interacting mode of being and the after fruit eating and snake interacting mode of being. And I think it's reasonable to think of that on a historical timeline. You know, that is one of the major, those are two of the major forces that shaped our evolutionary history. And the idea that things were different before that and after that is a perfectly reasonable presupposition. Something put us on the path to very, very rapid cortical development. Vision is certainly one of those factors. So, and the fruit eating element, well, that's where we have color vision. So, and it isn't obvious exactly what that did, but it did a lot of things. So, and then the next thing is, well, there's no moral knowledge. Now that's interesting because it implies that there's some tight link between having your eyes closed and not having moral knowledge. So to have your eyes closed is to not to be able to see. So there's a kind of unconsciousness about it. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. Okay, so that's quite an interesting sequence of events. So they're tempted by this thing that's subtle and dangerous. And the consequence of the temptation is the ingestion of something, the incorporation of something with transformative properties. And the transformation is profound. What happens is they open their eyes. Well, that's coming to consciousness. That's exactly what that is. You know, when a kitten opens its eyes, it finally enters the world, you know. So people had their eyes closed before this event. Well, so they weren't conscious in the same way. And that would account for the unity of experience. They're not separated from they're not separate beings on the ground of existence. That's one way of thinking about it. They have the same kind of life as animals do. They're just unconscious, or at least non-self-conscious entities of nature. There's no nakedness. There's no knowledge of good and evil. I mean, you don't blame a lion for eating a sheep. Well, I guess they used to eat sheep in the Middle East, right? You don't think that's an evil. You don't think of the lion as evil. You just think that that's what lions do. Now, if someone comes along and steals your sheep, well, that's a whole different issue. All of a sudden, there's a moral issue that's overlaid upon that, and you might say, well, why is all of a sudden there a moral issue? And then the answer to that would be, well, the person either does know the difference between good and bad, or should know it. And if he says, well, I'm just acting like a lion, no one's gonna accept that as an excuse. And the reason for that is there's a basic assumption that there's something that you know that lions don't. And why? Well, it's because your eyes are open in a different way. Okay, well, that seems to be reasonable. So they open their eyes and bang, they know they're naked. Now that's an interesting juxtaposition. Okay, so let's say you develop a higher form of consciousness, and that makes you self-conscious. So there's two things happening here. There's an elevation of consciousness, but out of that springs self-consciousness. And then you got to think, well, what does self-consciousness mean exactly? Well, because you're not fully self-conscious, and the reason you're not fully self-conscious is because you don't know everything about yourself, right? So you're ignorant of a lot of your own being. But there's a lot of your being you're not ignorant about. Well, you can identify yourself as an individual. So you've got the identify yourself in the mirror trick down, which is kind of the standard trick for animal self-consciousness. But that's only the beginning. It's the bare beginnings of self-consciousness. If you're self-conscious, you know where your boundaries are. Because what's inside the boundary is you and what's outside isn't you. But then there's other boundaries that you have. There's a temporal boundary. There's the time when you weren't, and there's the time when you won't be. And so there's a boundary in space, but there's a boundary in time. And that means that as soon as you become self-conscious, you know that you're going to die. And so that's the tight link between the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and death in the Old Testament, or in the Genesis story. So, and you might say, well, you were going to die before. And fair enough. But there's a big difference between the death of a self-conscious entity and death. In the one case, it's a natural process. That's natural death, let's say. In the other one, it's a catastrophe of being for the self-conscious individual. And so the other thing that happens is in the Genesis story that discovery is portrayed as a permanent rift in the structure of being. That's why it's such a deep sin. It's like all of a sudden everything is different and it will never be the same again no matter what happens. And you might say, well, obviously God was an enemy of higher consciousness. It's like, well, there's lots of interpretations of Genesis that took exactly that stance. They said, well, God was an enemy of higher consciousness. He wanted things to remain in an unconscious paradise, and that it was human unwillingness to behave and curiosity that got us into the problem that we're in, and it's actually a catastrophe. And then other people who were sort of that had more, say, admiration for the illumination and self-consciousness elements said that the thing that tempted human beings was a greater God than the God that originally did the creation. That was a Gnostic idea. So the serpent there becomes an agent of revelation in a sense.